This is part 2 of the Blazor Server database tutorial. In part 1, we discussed why and how you should use a context factory instead of DB context, which is crucial in Blazor Server apps for data integrity, and we looked at how to define a service to perform all the database operations. We went through the steps of doing everything on a development environment, and we got to the point where we want to finish up the work to get it all moved to production. And so, quick review here. Here's what we want to do. We want to get an empty database in Microsoft Azure. We're going to choose an inexpensive tier and make sure we delete things so we don't get charged. We're going to publish our web app to Microsoft Azure. And we're going to configure Azure to set a connection string that'll override appsettings.json. And last, we'll show how we actually do create that production database. I had originally talked about using SQL Server Management Studio to import and export, but that's not really the greatest thing to do. You can see why here. So instead, or in addition, I'm going to show how to use Script-Migration to create and update the production database. So let's get started. I've launched Microsoft Azure, I've logged in, and we're ready to create our database. So let's create it right now. We don't want an expensive database, and so first we've got to enter the database name, and we want to choose development. And we can configure it, and let's see what we want to choose here. We want a basic, and this is a very inexpensive database, and we'll use that one, so I'll click apply. It will allow us to review and create, so let's do that. And from this page, we can actually create it. It's submitting everything. And let's pause this here while it finishes up. Okay, we now have that database on Microsoft Azure. We can go to that resource and take a look at it. There's not much to see here, so we will get out of Azure and go to the next step, which is to publish our app to Microsoft Azure. We're in Visual Studio 2022 here, so let's take our app and let's get it published. So we're going to go to Azure, and it's going to be an app service on Windows, and we're going to have to create a new app. We'll put it in this personal service group, but let's create a new app. I already have a hosting plan, so we'll just use that one. And I'll try to rename this. This gets plugged in here by default, so it's almost guaranteed to be a unique name, but it's kind of an ugly name for our app. I'm going to try to rename this and see if there's a name that already exists out there, and that, in which case we couldn't use it. So I've renamed it. Let's see what happens if we try to create it. Okay, it got created, so let's finish this up. And let's close this. We can see it's now ready to be published, so we'll click this publish. You can see the name here, and you can actually see the URL that we'll use to access it. So let's go up here and click publish. I had paused recording while it finished publishing. When it got done, it launched the website. Now, I can't go to volunteers, and I'm not going to try. We know we have a database, but it's empty. It has no tables in it. So we're just going to get bad errors if we try to use this. So let me close this browser, and we'll go on to the next steps. Okay, we want to set up a connection string for our database on Azure. I've already logged into Azure. Let's go to the databases here, and let's select our database that we just created. And Azure will be very nice to us. It's going to show us the connection strings that we can use to access the database. It still has to be plugged into our web app so our web app knows to use it, but this will show us what the connection string should actually be. So let me click on this. We don't care about this connection string up here, but I'll be copying this connection string on the bottom, and we'll use it to put into our web app to override appsettings.json. I should have mentioned from the very beginning that I have a subscription to an SQL Server, which provided me an admin ID and a password. So we're ready to go now into the app services so we can connect that connection string to our web app. Let's click App Services and then click our app right here. Next, go here to Settings and click Configuration, and we'll add a new connection string by clicking right here. The name up here had to match what was in our config file on dev, our appsettings.json file actually. I've got the value in here for our connection string with the correct user ID and password, and it will be for SQL Server, so we're ready to click OK. So hopefully everything will work now. We have our connection string in here with the name of default. If we need to change it or edit it, we can over here. But let's give it a try. Now there's no data in there yet, but we're set up for everything now. Let's go to the next step. I forgot to mention in the previous little few minutes, don't forget to click the Save button to save this connection string in here. So let's save this now. Okay, I saved it. I've gone back to my home here on Azure. Let's click on our app service, and I'm just going to copy this and save it in Notepad or somewhere, because it's what it will allow us to get to the website here in a little while. Okay, we're back in Visual Studio because we want to run some commands here. So let's go to the console, and here's the command that we want to run. Now you might want to research on Google Script-Migration command, because there's all sorts of variations depending on how many migrations you've done on your development system and what you want to generate to put over to your production systems and what level they're at. In our case, I know that the production has no tables at all. And this will actually create everything to get us completely up to date. And so let's run this command. This idempotent is what will let it just kind of do everything correctly on the production server. So I've run the command, and you can see what it does here is it creates SQL. And if we run this SQL on the server on Azure, it will create our tables to match what we have here on dev. And you can look at this at your leisure, but essentially it has the two steps that we did. It creates the volunteers table, and then if you remember later, we altered that table to add a new column to it, this volunteer email. So this SQL we're now going to run on the production Azure server. I'll copy all this SQL and save it on Notepad so we can run it here in a minute. Okay, I've launched SQL Server Management Studio. I've logged in with my admin user ID and password for the database on Azure, and I've right-clicked our database here to create a new query over on the right here, and I have pasted in that query that we generated on Visual Studio. So now I'm going to execute this query and we will see what happens. It ran very quickly. Let's refresh our tables and see what we've got here. Okay, we have a table and we have the columns. We probably don't have any data yet, but that's okay. Everything should work. Let's go find out. Okay, I've gone to our website here, and you can see it loaded this page correctly. If we go to volunteers, there are none. We can add a new, see what happens, and that works pretty good. I did go back and do all the stuff that you learned in this video. I changed it so that these fields could be nullable, and if we save it like this, you can see that we don't get an exception. So let me, just to refresh your memory, I'll bring up Visual Studio and show you how I did it. I put the question mark here after string to make these nullable. Then I went in and created another migration and updated the database. That solved everything on my development system. And then I used the Script-Migrations command to get the SQL that I could go run on the Azure database, and I did that. And I republished this application with these things being nullable. And so now everything works where you're not required to enter a phone or an email. Well, that concludes this tutorial. I hope you found it helpful. I may be pushing this code up to GitHub and make it publicly accessible. So you may check for that. I hope it was helpful. Have a good day.